Conscience is the call of care from the uncanniness of being enthralled that summons Dasein to its almost potentiality for being guilt. We showed that wanting to have a conscience corresponded to understanding the summons. Both of these characterizations are not immediately harmonious with the vulgar interpretation of conscience. Indeed, they seem to be in direct conflict with it. We call this interpretation of conscience vulgar because, in characterizing this phenomenon and describing its function, it keeps to what they know as conscience, how they follow it or fail to follow it. But must the ontological interpretation agree with the vulgar interpretation at all? Should not the latter be, in principle, ontologically suspect? If Dasein initially and for the most part understands itself in terms of what it takes care of, and if it interprets all its modes of behavior as taking care of things, then will there not be falling prey and covering over in its interpretation of precisely the way of its being that, as a call, seeks to bring it back from its lostness in the cares of the they? Everydayness takes Dasein as something at hand that is taken care of, that is regulated and calculated. Life is a business, whether or not it covers its costs. With regard to the vulgar kind of being of Dasein itself, there is thus no guarantee that the interpretation of conscience arising from it, or the theories of conscience oriented toward it, have attained the appropriate ontological horizon for its interpretation. Nevertheless, even the vulgar experience of conscience must somehow pre-ontologically get at the phenomenon. Two things follow from this. On the one hand, the everyday interpretation of conscience cannot be valid as the ultimate criterion for the objectivity of an ontological analysis. On the other hand, such an analysis is not justified in elevating itself over the everyday understanding of conscience and passing over the anthropological, psychological, and theological theories of conscience based on it. If the existential analysis has exposed the phenomenon of conscience in its ontological roots, then the vulgar interpretations must be intelligible precisely in terms of that analysis. They must be intelligible finally in the ways they miss the phenomenon and why they cover it over. However, since in the context of problems in this inquiry, the analysis of conscience is only subservient to the ontological, fundamental question, the characterization of the connection between the existential interpretation of conscience and the vulgar interpretation of conscience will have to be satisfied with an indication of the essential problem. In this vulgar interpretation of conscience, there are four objections to our interpretation of conscience as the summons of care to being guilty. 1. Conscience has an essentially critical function. 2. Conscience always speaks relative to a definite deed that has been done or wished for. 3. According to experience, the voice is never related so radically to the being of Dasein. 4. Our interpretation pays no attention to the basic forms of the phenomenon, to evil and good conscience, to what reprimands and warns. Let us begin our discussion with the last reservation. In all interpretations of conscience, it is the evil or bad conscience that has priority. Conscience is primarily bad. Such a conscience makes known to us that in every experience of conscience, something like a guilty gets experienced first. But in the idea of bad conscience, how is this making itself known of evil understood? The experience of conscience turns up after the deed has been done or left undone. The voice follows up the transgression and points back to the event through which Dasein has burdened itself with guilt. If conscience makes known of being guilty, this cannot occur as a summons to, but as a pointing that reminds us of the guilt incurred. But does the fact that the voice comes later prevent the call from being basically a calling for? The fact that the voice is grasped as a stirring of conscience that follows after is not yet evidence for a primordial understanding of the phenomenon of conscience. What if the factical indebtedness were only the occasion for the factical calling of conscience? What if the interpretation we described of bad conscience got stuck halfway? That this is true can be seen from the ontological forehaving, within whose scope the phenomenon has been brought by this interpretation. The voice is something that turns up. It has its place in the series of present experiences, and it follows after the experience of the deed. But neither the call, nor the past deed, nor the guilt assumed are events with the character of something present that runs its course. The call has the kind of being of care. And the call, Dasein, is ahead of itself in such a way that at the same time it directs itself back to its thrownness. Only by first positing that Dasein is a serial connection of successive experiences is it possible to take the voice as something coming afterwards, something later that necessarily refers back. The voice does call back, but it calls back beyond the past deed into throne being guilty, which is earlier than any indebtedness Verschuldung. But the call back at the same time calls forth a being guilty, as something to be seized upon in one's own existence, in such a way that authentic, existential being guilty precisely comes after the call, and not the other way around. Basically, bad conscience is so far from reproving and pointing back, that it rather points forward by calling back into thrownness. The order of succession in which experiences run their course does not yield the phenomenal structure of existing. If the characterization of bad conscience does not get at the primordial phenomenon, still less can this be done by characterizing the good conscience, whether one takes it as an independent form of conscience or as one essentially founded upon bad conscience. As the bad conscience makes known a being evil, the good conscience would have to make known the being good of Dasein. One can easily see that conscience that used to be the emanation of divine power now becomes the slave of Pharisaism. It is supposed to let human beings say of themselves, "I am good." Who else can say this, and who would be less willing to affirm it than one who is good? But from this impossible consequence of the idea of good conscience, the fact only becomes apparent that being guilty is what conscience calls. To escape this consequence, one has interpreted good conscience as a privation of the bad one, and defined it as an experienced lack of bad conscience. 9. According to this, the good conscience would be an experience of the call not turning up, that is, that I have nothing to reproach myself with. But how is this lack experienced The supposed experience is not the experience of a call at all, but the self-verification that a deed attributed to Dasein was not committed by it, and that Dasein is therefore innocent. Becoming certain of not having done something does not have the character of a phenomenon of conscience at all. On the contrary, it can rather mean a forgetting of conscience, that is, that one moves out of the possibility of being able to be summoned. This certainty contains the tranquilizing suppression of wanting to have a conscience, that is, of understanding one's almost and constant being guilty. Good conscience is neither an independent form of conscience, nor a founded form of conscience, that is, it is not a phenomenon of conscience at all. Since talk about a good conscience arises from the experience of conscience of everyday Dasein, the latter only betrays the fact that basically it does not get at the phenomenon, even when it speaks of bad conscience. For factically, the idea of bad conscience is oriented toward that of the good conscience. The everyday interpretation maintains itself in the dimension of calculating and taking care of guilt and innocence, and balancing them out. It is in this horizon that the voice of conscience is experienced. In characterizing the primordiality of the ideas of a bad and a good conscience, we have also already decided as to the distinction between a conscience that points ahead and warns, and one that points back and reprimands. It is true that the idea of the warning conscience comes closest to the phenomenon of summoning to. It shares with the latter the character of pointing ahead. But this agreement is only an illusion after all. The experience of a warning conscience again sees the voice only as oriented toward the willed deed from which it wants to deter us. As the suppression of what is wanted, the warning is thus possible only because the warning call aims at the potentiality of being of Dasein, that is, at its understanding of itself in being guilty, which is that on what is wished for first gets shattered. The warning conscience has the function of sporadically governing our staying free from indebtedness. The experience of a warning conscience sees the tendency of its call only to the extent that it remains accessible to the common sense of the they. Third reservation appeals to the fact that the everyday experience of conscience is not familiar with anything like a being summoned to be guilty. This we must admit. But does the everyday experience of conscience then guarantee that the complete possible content of the call of the voice of conscience is heard in it? Does it follow from this that the theories of conscience based on the vulgar experience of conscience have secured for themselves the appropriate ontological horizon for the analysis of the phenomenon? Does not rather an essential kind of being of Dasein, falling prey, show that this being initially and for the most part understands itself ontically in terms of the horizon of taking care of things, but ontologically defines being in the sense of objective presence? But from this comes a twofold covering over of the phenomenon. The theory sees a series of experiences or psychic processes that are for the most part quite indefinite in their kind of being. Experience encounters conscience as a judge and an admonisher with whom Dasein calculatingly makes deal. The fact that Kant takes the idea of a court of justice as the key idea for the basis of his interpretation of conscience is not a matter of chance, but was suggested by the idea of moral law, although his concept of morality was far removed from utilitarianism and eudaimonism. Even the theory of value, whether it be formally or materially conceived, has a metaphysics of morals, that is, an ontology of Dasein and of existence as its unspoken ontological presupposition. Dasein is conceived as a being to be taken care of, and this taking care of has the meaning of actualizing values or satisfying norm. Appealing to the full range of what everyday conscience is familiar with as the sole higher court for the interpretation of conscience cannot be justified unless it has first considered whether conscience can become authentically accessible in this way at all. Thus the further objection that the existential interpretation overlooks the fact that the call of conscience is always related to a definite actualized or willed deed also loses its force. It cannot be denied that the call is frequently experienced as having such a tendency. It remains questionable only whether this experience of the call lets it proclaim itself fully. The common sense interpretation might believe that it keeps itself to facts, and yet in the end has restricted the call's scope of disclosure by its very common sense. As little as the good conscience can be placed in the service of a Pharisaism, just as little may the function of the bad conscience be reduced to pointing out indebtednesses that are objectively present or to repressing possible ones. As if Dasein were a household, whose indebtedness only needed to be balanced out in an orderly way for the self to be able to stand by as an uninvolved spectator as these experiences run their course. But if what is primary in the call is not a relatedness to factically present guilt or culpable deeds that have been factically willed, and if thus the reprimanding and warning types of conscience express no primordial functions of the call, then the ground is also taken out from under the feet of the first reservation, that the existential interpretation fails to recognize the, essentially, critical accomplishment of conscience. This reservation, too, arises from a view of the phenomenon which is genuine within certain limits. For indeed, in the content of the call, nothing can be shown that the voice positively recommends and commands. But how is this positivity that is missing from what conscience does to be understood? Does it follow from this that conscience has a negative character? We miss a positive content in what is called because of the expectation that we will be given information that is actually useful about assured possibilities of action that are avoidable and calculable. This expectation is based on the horizon of interpretation of the common sense way of taking care of things, which forces the existence of Dasein to be subsumed under the idea of a governable course of business. Such expectations, which also in part inexplicitly underlie the demands of a material ethics of value as opposed to a merely formal one, are, however, disappointed by conscience. Such practical directions are not given by the call of conscience for the sole reason that it summons Dasein to existence, to its own potentiality of being a self. With its unequivocally calculable maxims that one is led to expect, conscience would deny to existence nothing less than the possibility of act. Because conscience evidently cannot be positive in this way, neither does it function in the same way, only negatively. The call discloses nothing that could be positive or negative as something to be taken care of, because it has to do with an ontologically completely different being, namely, existence. On the contrary, the correctly understood call gives the most positive thing of all in the existential sense, the almost possibility that Dasein can give itself as a calling back that calls it forth to its factical potentiality of being a self. Here the call authentically means to bring oneself to factical action, but only by setting forth the existential structure implied in our understanding of the summons when we hear it authentically, shall we attain a completely adequate interpretation of what is called in the call. We wanted to show how the phenomena that alone are familiar to the vulgar interpretation of conscience point back to the primordial meaning of the call of conscience when they are understood in an ontologically appropriate way. Then, since the vulgar interpretation arises from the limitations of the entangled self-interpretation of Dasein, and since falling prey belongs to care itself, we must show that this interpretation, even though it is self-evident, is by no means accidental. The ontological critique of the vulgar interpretation of conscience could be subject to the misunderstanding that, by showing the lack of existential primordiality of the everyday experience of conscience, one wanted to pass judgment upon the existential moral quality of Dasein. Just as existence is not necessarily and directly jeopardized by an ontologically insufficient understanding of conscience, the existential understanding of the call is not guaranteed by an existentially adequate interpretation of conscience either. Seriousness is no less possible in the vulgar experience of conscience than is a lack of seriousness in a more primordial understanding of conscience. Still, the existentially more primordial interpretation also discloses possibilities of a more primordial existential understanding, as long as our ontological concepts do not get cut off from ontic experience.